France, August 1392. King Charles VI is riding through the forest of Le Mans with a column of knights. He is 23 years old. He has been king for 12 years. By every account available, his council, his chroniclers, the foreign ambassadors at his court, he is intelligent, physically strong, and genuinely liked by the people who serve him. Then from the edge of the trees a barefoot man runs out and seizes the king's horse by the bridle. The man is shouting a warning, a plot, a betrayal. Someone intends to kill the king. The guards drag him away. The column moves on, but the king is now watching the shadows between the trees. A servant drops a lance. The sound echoes through the trees, and the king draws his sword and attacks his own men. By the time his knights manage to restrain him, 4 of them are dead. The king does not recognize any of them. He does not recognize his brother. He does not know his own name. The episode lasts several hours. Then it stops as suddenly as it began. It will happen again, 43 more times over the next 30 years. And for all 30 of those years, the most powerful court in medieval Europe will manage, negotiate, and actively conceal the mental collapse of the man at its center. The entire structure of their world depended on pretending otherwise. By the end of this video, you'll understand what the court of Charles VI actually did and how its actions influenced the destiny of the kingdom, based on chronicles written by those who were there. You'll understand the specific psychological mechanism that allows an entire institution to look directly at something it cannot name and keep functioning anyway. What happened in the Palais de la Cité between 1392 and 1422 is one of the earliest documented case studies of that mechanism on record. And there's a third thing, something the standard historical accounts almost universally skip. What the king believed about his own body during his episodes, because that particular detail is not medieval superstition. It is a clinical phenomenon that psychiatrists still document today. The people who witnessed it wrote it down in detail because they couldn't make sense of it either. To understand what happened after August 1392, you have to understand what the French monarchy was. In medieval France, the king was not simply a political figure. He was the point at which divine authority and earthly power were understood to converge. The royal body was, in a very literal sense, a theological object. The king touched those with scrofula, a bacterial infection, and was believed to heal them. His death was not merely a political transition, it was a tear in the fabric of the world. The king's authority was not personal, it was structural, and that structure had to keep working even as the man at its center ceased to be reliably present. The 4th book of Froissart's Chronicles describes the weeks following the forest episode. The king's council convened immediately, not to seek treatment. Medieval medicine had no framework for what they were witnessing, but to decide what to tell the kingdom. The decision they reached has a name in the historical record, a malady, an illness, the record said, nothing more. The distinction was everything. An ill king could recover. A mad king had no legitimate authority, and without a legitimate king at its center, the court had no legitimate existence. So the court invented a king that functioned, even when the actual king could not. 5 months later, it happened again. January 28, 1393, a masquerade ball at the Hôtel Saint-Paul, thrown for a lady-in-waiting's 3rd marriage. Charles VI and 5 of his noblemen had themselves sewn into linen costumes soaked in pitch resin and covered with feathers, disguising themselves as chained wild men. Every torch in the ballroom had been moved away from the dance floor before the king arrived. The court records note the precaution. People were aware the costumes would catch. Then the king's brother, Louis of Orleans, arrived late. He was carrying a torch. He brought it close to examine the dancers. 4 of the 5 noblemen burned to death in the royal ballroom. The king survived because his aunt, Joan of Berry, pulled him away from the fire and smothered the flames with her skirts before they reached him. He survived unharmed. When he was told what had happened, he had another episode. Both the Grande Chronique de France and Froissart record it. They agree on one detail. The king had no memory of the fire. Van der Kolk calls this cumulative trauma. Each event compounds the last, the threshold shifts lower, and the body keeps its own account, whether the conscious mind does or not. Le Mans was the first event. The Bal des Ardents was the second. What developed in the years that followed was something neither Froissart nor his contemporaries had a name for. During several of his episodes, Charles VI developed a fixed belief about his own body. He believed he was made of glass. The belief was literal. He was convinced that his body was composed of glass, that if anyone touched him, he would shatter. He refused to be approached. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to reinforce himself. He moved with extraordinary caution, terrified of breaking. The glass delusion is not unique to Charles VI. The psychiatrist Edward Shorter has cataloged dozens of documented cases across Europe spanning 3 centuries. Aristocrats, clergy, ordinary people, no contact between them. The same specific belief recurring independently. What makes it clinically significant is not the strangeness, but the consistency. The leading explanation in modern psychiatry is that it represents a particular form of depersonalization, a disruption in the sense of physical self, where the body no longer feels solid or real. Glass is fragile, transparent, and can be seen through. For someone experiencing a collapse of bodily identity, it is, in a perverse way, a coherent metaphor for what the body feels like from the inside. Charles VI's doctors, his physicians, his astrologers, the monks who prayed over him, had no framework for any of this. What they had was Froissart's observation that during his lucid periods, the king was mortified by what he had done during the episodes. He remembered nothing of the forest. He was told, and the gap between the man he believed himself to be and the man the witnesses described was, by all accounts, devastating to him. That gap between the self a person presents to the world and what erupts when that presentation collapses is not a medieval problem. It is the central question of every serious psychological framework developed in the last 150 years. The anthropologist Rene Girard spent decades studying how communities survive internal crises. His central argument: when a group faces a threat it cannot directly address, it redirects outward, finds a target, names it as the source of the problem, and organizes itself around the act of exclusion. The court of Charles VI had no external enemy to blame. The king's illness had no political cause and no political solution. So it performed a different operation. It split the king in 2. There was the official king, present at ceremonies, referenced in documents, the source of all legal authority, and there was the actual king, unpredictable, sometimes violent, sometimes catatonic, sometimes convinced he was made of glass. The court maintained both versions simultaneously, switching between them with a fluency that required, as contemporary documents show, enormous collective effort. Christine de Pizan, one of the most prominent writers at the French court during this period, describes the choreography in remarkable detail. When the king had an episode, key ceremonies were quietly rescheduled. Documents requiring his signature were prepared in batches during lucid intervals. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, was systematically excluded from power when the king was present, then abruptly required to govern when he was not. Here is how far that choreography had to reach. The Religieux de Saint-Denis, a monk who documented the court throughout this period, records that during the worst episodes, the king no longer recognized his own name. He would deny being Charles. He would deny being king at all. The court had to manage a man who was, at intervals, a stranger to his own identity, while maintaining every external form that depended on that identity being intact. Van der Kolk describes the state of a system that has learned to expect catastrophe at any moment and reorganized its entire functioning around that expectation. The French court between 1392 and 1422 is a textbook case. Every decision carried a contingency. Every ceremony had an exit. The court did not manage the king's illness. It absorbed it and kept moving. Stop here for a second. Think of an institution you know, a company, a school, a family, a government, that kept functioning around something everyone could see but nobody named. What was it and how long did it last? Drop it in the comments. I read them. The pattern we're describing is not medieval, it's everywhere. Now, the part of this story that the history books tend to skip. What it cost. The mechanism that kept the French court functional also made it incapable of responding to the threats accumulating outside it. In 1415, an English army under Henry V crossed into France. At Agincourt, on October 25th, between 6,000 and 10,000 French soldiers died. The English losses were in the hundreds. The causes are military and logistical, but the French command structure at Agincourt is inseparable from what the court had been doing for 23 years. A system organized around a void at its center cannot make coherent decisions under pressure. The survival instinct of an institution and the survival instinct of the people it exists to protect are not the same thing. At Agincourt, the gap between those two became visible. This is what chronic institutional denial costs, and the cost accumulates slowly. In 1420, with the king still alive and still officially ruling, Charles VI signed the Treaty of Troyes. His son was declared illegitimate and disinherited. The French crown was to pass to the English king upon Charles VI's death. The man who had been protected, managed, and covered for 30 years signed away the inheritance of France in a document his court had prepared for him during a lucid interval. He died 2 years later in 1422. The court that had sustained the fiction of his rule for 30 years dissolved almost immediately. The mechanisms that had held everything together, the batched documents, the rescheduled ceremonies, the permanent contingencies, had no purpose without the king at their center. The court was not dishonest, it was not cynical. The people inside it believed, in the deepest sense, that what they were doing was necessary, that naming the king's condition would have been more destructive than concealing it. They may have been right in the short term. They were wrong over 30 years. Back to the forest of Le Mans. The 4 knights who died in August 1392 were buried with full honors. Their deaths were recorded as a regrettable accident, a moment of royal illness not to be discussed further. The column continued to its destination. Nobody named what they had seen. Fear had something to do with it. But naming it would have required answering a question with no safe answer. What do you do when the center of your entire world is no longer there? They did what institutions always do. They closed around the void, they maintained the surface, and they kept moving. The mechanism documented in the court of Charles VI is not a medieval peculiarity. It is a human pattern, the gap between what an organization can see and what it allows itself to name. That gap is always, eventually, the distance between what a system claims to be and what it actually does. The historians read the archives, the psychologists recognized the pattern. This channel lives at that intersection. Every video in this series has looked at what happens when the mechanism fails. when institutions close around a problem instead of naming it, and when the cost of that closure accumulates over time. Next week, we look at the other side of that question, October 1962. A Soviet submarine in the Atlantic cut off from all communication carrying a nuclear torpedo. 3 officers need to agree to fire. 2 of them say yes. 1 man says no. That's next week.